Good day, everybody. I'm Joan Brzezinski, and I am the director of the University of Minnesota China Center. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar with Tom Hanson. Before we start, I'll offer some participation tips. At the end of the program, we'll answer questions that you submit through Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We hope that we can answer as many as possible, but of course may be limited by time. For any other questions or technical issues you might experience during the program, please use the chat function to connect with the panelists directly. This program will be recorded and available on our website. So many thanks to Global Programs and Strategy Alliance for their support and direction. We're especially grateful for the leadership of Associate Vice President and Dean for International Programs, Meredith McQuaid. Meredith, would you please give us a welcome? She's muted.
Can you unmute?
Okay. There we are. Just takes a few clicks. Hi, everybody. I'm Meredith, and I'm really nice to see so many joining us today for such an important topic. It seems every day there's news about China in the paper, China and the U.S. in the paper, the U.S. and China. And of course, we have so many relationships between the University of Minnesota and China that this is just an incredible time for us to be learning more about the history between our two countries and also maybe what lies ahead. And we are really grateful for Tom Hanson. He's a great friend of the university, and we're excited to hear from him. He's got a wealth of experience to share with us. So thanks for being here. We're going to continue to offer this kind of programming throughout the summer because there's just so much to talk about. So thanks for being here. Back to you, Joan.
Yes, so by way of background, the University of Minnesota China Center has served as a bridge between the University of Minnesota and China for more than 40 years. Our mission to build bridges of exchange, promote understanding, facilitate academic and research collaborations between the U.S. and China has never been more important. In recent months, the U.S. trade deal, responses to the coronavirus global pandemic, and other issues are causing tensions across the globe. What's the U.S. strategy? We all know that equal partnerships experience both confrontation and collaboration, but what's the best way forward? Today's speaker, Mr. Tom Hanson, is the chair of Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations and co-chair of Minnesota China's Business Council. He's a diplomat in residence at the Alworth Institute for International Studies at the University of Minnesota Duluth. Mr. Hanson is also a former Foreign Service officer with the U.S. Department of State. He is an expert in foreign policy and geopolitics, and regularly presents his analysis on U.S.-China foreign relations at programs across the U.S. Please be on the watch for his forthcoming book, Global Governance and Futures, with contributions by international scholars and published by Routledge. Please welcome Tom.
Thank you so much, Joan, and thank you also, Meredith, and thank you, Hyan, for all the help here logistically. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. You know, we're living, as we all know, in a time of crisis on multiple fronts. 2020 is starting off with a bang. It's not just the pandemic. It's a year of crisis between the United States and China. This is a severe situation. The world's #1 and #2 economies are on a slippery slope, it seems, to greater estrangement. You know, just in the last few days, a number of things have been happening that are adding tensions to the relationship. There's talk of possible decoupling, perhaps a new Cold War. I mean, we have to hope it doesn't go that far, but the trend is not good right now. So what I'd like to do today is to take a deeper look at what are some of the factors that are really going to set the course for U.S.-Chinese relations, the factors that are going to have to be dealt with between our two countries to reach accommodation. And I will spend a fair amount of time on each one. And at that point, we'll open to questions. You probably will have questions about things happening immediately because there certainly are a lot of new developments going on. I'm going to just get in now to the images. So let's see. Hyan. Okay, I think I can do it this way. Okay, Hyan, there's a problem, and that is that all the images are on the right-hand side of my screen. And that's where the
It's
advanced
okay, it
button
looks
is.
normal here.
There we go. Okay, there we go. Got it now. Thank you. So just in the last few days, we've all been following the dramatic events in Hong Kong. The National People's Congress of the Chinese Communist Party just yesterday finally approved the drafting of a new national security legislation for Hong Kong, which will be imposed on the parliament there. The final draft will probably not be ready for implementation until as late as September, but this is being taken as a sign of lessening independence for Hong Kong. Mike Pompeo just the other day officially declared that as far as the US government is concerned, Hong Kong is no longer autonomous from China. That's the exact wording in a piece of US legislation which calls for measures in retaliation in that case. We'll see what happens. There's talk of targeted sanctions against individual Chinese leaders or individual Chinese companies. There's also a possibility that the US could theoretically revoke Hong Kong's special status. That would be a very dramatic move. It would vastly undercut the economy of Hong Kong. I think for that reason, it's not likely to happen, at least in the first instance. But the Hong Kong situation is a real problem right now. The United States is now moving toward delisting Chinese companies from our stock market, from NASDAQ. Luckin Coffee is the first one. The idea being that there should be more auditing done of Chinese companies by a US institution, and that if any Chinese company is not audited in that way over a 3-year period, it would delist. So we're beginning to see the potential for some financial decoupling in addition to the other problems. Up in Canada, Meng Wanzhou went before the court yesterday. The court decided that the grounds were there for her to be extradited to the United States. She is the CFO of Huawei, the daughter of the founder. She's been in prison, in detention rather, in Canada for a good while. There are many more steps to take in the judicial process, but this is another issue that is festering. Also, just yesterday, the US government announced that it's looking into barring Chinese students from studying in the US who may be from institutions in China that have connections to the military. You know, how you would actually determine that, it's hard to say, but these are just examples of the kinds of things that are building up now in the relationship. It seems a long time ago, in 2017, when Xi Jinping came to Mar-a-Lago. It was a very sunny atmosphere. It was the first year of the Trump administration. The tariff policies had not yet begun. He was focused on healthcare domestically. This, of course, is Ivanka's daughter reciting a Chinese poem to Xi Jinping and his wife. And as I say, that seems like a long time ago, and it was just a couple of years. And it is, as all this is happening now, exactly 40 years since the United States and China established diplomatic relations in 1979. So a lot has happened in those 40 years, and here we are now in this situation. John Pomfret, who is a real China expert, has been a journalist for many years, lived in China, a year or two ago wrote an excellent book called The Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom, in which he takes a look back at the history of our relationship. And his basic take on US and China is that we all through history have gone through cycles of mutual fascination and then estrangement, and that this is cyclical. We have to hope that it is, because we're certainly in a period of estrangement now. So if we look back to the history of the US and the People's Republic to get a sense of what the cycle has been. In 1945, Chiang Kai-shek of the Republic of China and Mao Zedong met in Chongqing in 1945. This was a brokered meeting, brokered by President Truman. They spent 7 days trying to negotiate their differences. Of course, things fell apart. A civil war ensued, and in 1949, the People's Republic was born. The United States and the PRC were deeply estranged from the beginning. In 1949, we instead had a close relationship with Taiwan. It's easy to forget that in those years, Taiwan was a member of, not just of the UN, but was one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, along with Russia, the United States, the UK, and France. So it was a radical turn of events in 1971 when suddenly the PRC, People's Republic, took the place of Taiwan in the UN on the Security Council. And this was a result of the diplomacy by Nixon and Kissinger, which resulted in their visit in 1972 to Beijing. Why did the US and China come together in 1972? It was in the face of a common adversary. Each of them were concerned about Russia, with the Soviet Union, and it was this mutual antipathy to Moscow that brought the two countries together. And really, it's been on an uphill swing ever since. Deng Xiaoping, of course, opening China in 1978. This is an interesting cover on Time magazine. The next China, will Deng's heirs turn Beijing into a superpower the world can love? And of course, in the immediate phase, there was a fascination. The US business community was very interested in the markets in China. So in spite of Tiananmen in 1989, which was a delay in the opening, things really got going in the 90s. And this was a period of bringing China into the world economy, the idea being that China would become a responsible stakeholder in the world economy. And sort of the implicit in that is the idea that China would change, that China would change the way it does things by having contact with the US and with the world economy. Robert Zoellick was the main proponent of this idea. He coined the phrase, former head of the World Bank. I sometimes think that it was probably unrealistic to think that China was going to change that way. And that maybe the reaction right now, at least in the US, is even stronger because our expectations were unrealistic in having China engage, or that the change at least would be happen more slowly. Now, in my view, the change toward where we are now actually took place from 2008 to 2010, and it took place during the Obama administration. Because the key advisors on Asia, and the fellow on the left there with Hillary is Kurt Campbell, who was one of the main architects of our policy toward China during the Obama years, looked at the situation in Asia, felt that our allies there were being drawn into the Chinese orbit without really thinking through the consequences, and that it would be necessary for the US to get re-involved in Asia. And it was chosen as a path to do that in the first year or so of the Obama administration to draw closer to the countries of ASEAN. There they are in red in the map I'm showing you now. Hillary became the first US Secretary of State to attend an ASEAN summit in Vietnam in 2010. And on that occasion, laid out a new US policy on the South China Sea. That we should be involved, the United States, at the table with our allies in Asia in negotiating with China. China, up until then, had taken an approach that let's let time play out. Deng Xiaoping famously said, South China Sea can be solved by the next generation. They'll be smarter than we are. But by 2008, with the financial crisis and this new assessment of what's happening in Asia, the United States came to the conclusion that time was not on our side. That up until then, I think the idea was that engaging China, things would move naturally in our direction. that assessment changed already in the Obama years. And the first Chinese reactions against this happened before Xi Jinping. It happened under Hu Jintao. And China was already asserting itself more in the South China Sea, and as we all know, the tensions ratcheted up. The Obama administration did not highlight trade as much in this period. They were looking more at the U.S. strategic position in Asia. But with President Trump, trade came to the head of the agenda. And as we know, in his second year, the tariffs began to be unrolled. I like to call these four fellows the four horsemen of the tariff apocalypse: Steve Mnuchin, Wilbur Ross, Robert Lighthizer, and Peter Navarro, who have been the brains behind the new approach to China on trade. But it has escalated now in these ensuing years from trade to technology, now to greater political tension. And so we're in a new situation. So now I want to take a look at these five realities that I mentioned and sort of assess each one and how they are unfolding and what role they play now in the relationship and in the future of the relationship. When Deng Xiaoping came in, Xi Jinping came in, he was the first Chinese leader to immediately become the head of the Chinese military upon assuming office. And he began to lay out an ambitious program for China aimed at the population, realizing that China had goals called the China Dream. And his famous formulation was that under Mao Zedong, China had stood up. Under Deng Xiaoping, China became rich, and now China would become strong. And so China has been more clearly looking at their interests as a rising power in the world. In fact, first meeting that Xi Jinping had with Obama in 2014 at Sunnylands, he discussed with Obama the dilemma that our two countries faced of a rising power and a status quo power, and how in the past, historically, situations like that don't end well. If you have a rising power, oftentimes there's conflict. And so, history theoretically is not on our side, and this relationship has to be handled very carefully. The U.S. side agreed. And so there were signs that serious discussion would be ongoing, dialogue, consultation on what was a very, very tricky relationship. China has what they call core interests, and they've been more overt in laying them out. China looks at Asia, as do we, in terms of two chains. The first island chain, and there you see it starting from South Korea, going past Taiwan, of course it includes Hong Kong, South China Sea, and the second island chain. So, many times as countries rise, they seek to have what's called strategic depth in their immediate regions. For our country, the United States, it took the form of the Monroe Doctrine and the whole idea of non-interference in our neighborhood. For Russia, right now, it's what they call the near abroad, where they feel that NATO is encroaching very close on their border. For China, it's the first island chain. And this includes, of course, the issues we're dealing with today: Taiwan, Hong Kong, South China Sea. Now, there is a fourth, South China Sea is becoming the fourth core interest. The other core interest is Xinjiang, out in Western China. So Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang are defined by China as core interests, with the South China Sea becoming that. So as China rises, it is building up, if you will, to be able to have a presence in the South China Sea. They're building a navy that is regional so far, weapon systems that are aimed primarily at Taiwan, but that could also hit American aircraft carriers. So this is the nature of a rising power, and this is how China defines it. Now, the problem is that the United States has an equally strong security view of Asia. And it's something that we've had ever since World War II, and it's something that isn't really given voice to always, but it's always there in the background and is today. When the US got involved in World War II and in an alliance system afterwards, it looked back to the fact that Japan and Germany, once they had succeeded in dominating their own regions, became a threat to the United States, potentially to the US homeland. The United States is blessed by geography. As Otto von Bismarck famously said, the United States is the luckiest country in the world. It's surrounded to the north and south by weak and friendly neighbors, to the east and west by fish. It's believed in Washington that we are able to project power the way we do globally because our own regional situation is stable. And we do not want any other region to come under the sway of a hegemon, the way it happened in World War II. In other words, we seek to prevent the rise of a peer competitor. That's the nomenclature in the US military. We want to prevent any power from dominating either Asia or Europe. And of course, what China is doing now, especially within the first island chain, bumps up against this basic American proposition. So under Trump, a new national security strategy was rolled out. Jim Mattis announced it a couple of years ago, singling out Russia and China as the two powers now that are becoming adversaries of ours that have to be contained. Basically, once again, Russia in Europe, China in Asia are seen as a threat to our peer competitor doctrine. It's not for nothing that China and Russia are drawing together right now. It's ironic that this triangle always is at play. It was our agreement with China back in the early 70s that Russia was a problem that brought China and the United States together. Now there's a perception by Russia and China that we are trying to blunt their status and their rise in the case of China. So this is the first fundamental point. These two outlooks, by China as it rises now, and by the US really ever since World War II. So something has got to be worked out. There have to be detailed discussions about the security relationship in Asia especially. There's no security architecture in Europe. There's no NATO in Europe, in Asia. Asia lacks security institutions. And so there's going to be a lot of work to be done to focus on this one basic reality, hopefully constructively as we go forward. Second reality is technology. Technology. Problems in the US-China relationships are not primarily about trade. It's all about tech. China has made great strides in technology. They're investing heavily, educating a STEM workforce that will be larger than that of the entire OECD by the mid-2020s. This is a poster from last year as China put a probe on the dark side of the moon. They have an active space program, which has implications for satellite technology. And problem with technology is that the new breakthroughs happening in AI and other areas have military implications. So what Washington is most concerned about from its point of view is rapid Chinese advances in quantum technology. China has some of the best minds going right now in quantum, and they're doing things that we have not yet done. For example, last year, China launched the world's first quantum communication satellite successfully, and they were able to communicate between Beijing, China, and Vienna, which is where the head of their quantum program studied, a quantum communication. And as CCTV reported it, this new probe will protect China from cyber attacks. The thing about quantum is, when it's harnessed, it cannot be hacked because it's not pluses and minuses. It's plus and minus at the same time. There's no there. And as a result, a quantum communication system will be potentially unhackable and quantum, when it's marshaled correctly, could break through any binary security system. So there are tremendous implications by what China is doing in quantum. This is, when I was in Washington recently, somebody used the word freaked out to describe how Washington saw this. Of course, 5G, we all hear about that. China is by far the leader in 5G technology with Huawei. We are aggressively trying to stop Huawei in its tracks, make sure it does not become the standard computing system for 5G. We're also going after other Chinese companies. SenseTime, for example, which is one of the biggest AI companies in the world. We've slapped sanctions on them. We're trying to cut them out because, and we're using human rights as the reason, they have provided facial recognition technology in Xinjiang. And of course, as we all know, the Chinese have cracked down on Xinjiang, detaining large numbers of Uyghurs, and they're using extensive facial recognition to do this. And SenseTime is providing those, and so we have now sanctions on SenseTime. Also, ByteDance, another huge AI company. They are the owners of TikTok, which is, of course, everywhere nowadays. The U.S. government is worried that through little TikTok, there could be information gathering on American citizens that could be put to negative use at some point. If we try to ban this, I'm imagining a huge demonstration of preteen girls in Washington, D.C., trying to demand that TikTok be brought back. But this, anyway, we're going after Chinese tech because there is this sense that we're falling behind. And then when you come to 6G, this is where it gets interesting. 6G will be very odd. It's going to involve computer arrays. It's going to be a whole different kind of technology than 5G. And China, on November 6, 2019, announced a major rollout of its 6G program. Chinese Ministry of Science and Technology. 2 teams, relevant government bodies, and 37 experts from universities, scientific research institutions, and companies. There they are. That's the group that is going to bring China to the fore in 6G. We have nothing like this going on yet. And Global Times, which of course is a pro-CCP organ, said in announcing this, quote, "The United States approach is driven by companies and cannot attract the best manpower and equipment from all sectors. The Chinese tech push is based on comprehensive research of all sectors under government guidance, which is surely more competitive. The U.S. technological approach of splendid isolation will soon lag behind as China and Europe cooperate." Now, once again, that kind of statement and this kind of program is being noticed in Washington. The head of U.S. technology, the U.S. Chief Technology Officer, we actually have one, Michael Kratsios, gave speeches last year saying straight out, the U.S. is falling behind China on AI and key technologies like quantum. And the way to meet this, he said, is to change the way we do things. We need collective power in the U.S. We need a greater government, private sector teaming up in a way, kind of what China is doing to meet this threat. And of course, this is what we did during World War II. It was a government and the scientists working jointly came up with radio technologies and ultimately the atom bomb. So in the Senate, people like Mark Warner of Virginia and Marco Rubio of Florida are also sounding the alarm, saying we need to change the way we do things. Now, we're a highly decentralized, deregulated economy and have become more and more so in recent decades. What form this could take is hard to say. But in this second area of technology, these are the realities now that have to be figured out and brought somehow into harmony with what's happening in the relationship. Now, the third area, and it has to do with technology, is governance. President Trump said last year at the World Economic Forum, and no one knew exactly what he meant at the time, he said, we will no longer accept state-run economies. We will no longer accept state roles in economies. Now, obviously, China still has that model. And if anything, under Xi Jinping, it's becoming more that way with more government involvement. Ever since he came into office, Xi Jinping has been all about governance. There have been 2 volumes of his writings and thoughts about governance, how China should be governed. I think he believes that that is the key to strength in the future, that well-governed countries with a certain amount of social capital or social buy-in will be the most stable and the strongest, and that the new technology should be harnessed in this effort. So, and he's got the backing of the big tech entrepreneurs in China. People like Jack Ma are big proponents of this new sort of using tech in governance. And as we all know, the result of this has been a lot of facial recognition technology around China, and something that's being rolled out called the social credit system. Now, this is piecemeal. How far this will go is hard to say, but the idea is to collate information on the citizenry, cell phones, facial recognition, everything else, to the point where you can assign each citizen a score, and there will be positive or negative influence based on that score. This is obviously very, very government-driven. It's very centralized. In terms of values, it certainly is at variance with a lot of Western values. I think that the party believes that this can be something that will make for what they call a more harmonious society. Of course, there is such a thing as too much harmony, but in the pandemic, we're seeing both sides of this Chinese approach now. Initially, local officials appeared fearful to report to the higher ups about what was going on. Information was squelched that cost the world time. But since then, China, using these new structures that it's developed, has been able to crack down on the virus very strongly, and including using cell phone apps. Anybody who's been in China recently knows that a lot of day-to-day activity now takes place with your cell phone. Credit cards are not used much anymore. It's all through the cell phone. So this sort of technological governance is showing, I think, for a lot of Chinese, at least, some positive results in the way that the coronavirus has been handled. Now, you don't necessarily have to be a centralized government like China to use these technologies. I mean, here's the British version of this that the National Health Service will start using to do contact tracing. Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea have also made ample use of these new technologies. So the whole issue of governance and technology is one that's on the agenda. And of course, right now, the United States strikes many people as being quite polarized. We're seeing, in terms of how we handle the virus, a lot of very individualistic behavior going on. We're very far behind in marshaling technology, whether it's testing or the use of cell phones, contact tracing. We'll get there. But it's, for the moment at least, this governance issue is cutting both ways. I'm not sure that either the U.S. or China is really gaining a lot of favor right now in the pandemic situation because mistakes have been made on both sides. But yes, other countries, are doing some of this, the same kind of thing that China is doing with the new technologies, and that raises then the fourth point that I want to stress, and that is the potential partners and allies who are out in the world. How are they going to react to this growing tension between China and the United States? China, with its One Belt, One Road, Belt and Road Initiative, which was rolled out a few years ago, is developing and fostering infrastructure that ideally will go all the way into Europe. There's a lot of buy-in in Europe, countries like Italy, but Eastern Europe. The European Union is about to have a major summit with China to discuss the relations on One Belt, One Road, and also opening up the Chinese economy more. There are very close interactions going on between Europe and China in this regard. But Europe, just as many of our Asian partners, are feeling torn between the United States and China, because obviously we are putting pressure on our allies not to go with Huawei, not to go with the One Belt, One Road. By the way, Obama also opposed the One Belt, One Road back during his administration. So it's kind of a small picture, but Germany will most likely be very important in how this goes. As I say, there will be a major summit in Leipzig with the 27 leaders of the European Union and China. As I say, we're trying to dissuade this kind of dialogue, but it's going forward. And the signs of how this is going in the midst of the pandemic are mixed. A recent poll in Germany by the Kerber Foundation, which is one of the main polling organizations there, came up with some rather startling results. When asked in the poll, which is the most important partner for Germany? This is a large poll of German citizens. Which is the most important partner, China or the US? In this year's poll, 37% said the US and 36% said China. Now, in the last poll a year ago, there was a 26-point gap in the US's favor over China in this poll. This year, there was a 1-point gap. And among 18 to 34-year-olds asked this question, 46% said they favored China, 35% said they favored the US. So I think the lesson here is that as this unfolds, the United States right now is threatening even our partners with tariffs, as we know. There's been a pretty harsh tone right across the board. And so we'll just have to see whether there can be coordination in the West or whether this kind of situation will develop. When it comes to Asia, as we all know, the United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations right at the beginning of Trump's term. Another grouping is taking shape now under Chinese Asia. Says this is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes all the countries listed there. And at the end of last year, they reached an agreement for a trade relationship. Now, the only country that didn't finally join was India, but all the other ones, South Korea, Japan, etc., all took place and joined in rather. And this is potentially significant. It's going to have a big impact on supply chains, especially because there are provisions in the RCEP, which single sourcing provisions, which will make it very easy for supply chains to develop all through Asia. So for the moment, at least, there is momentum in the Chinese Asian relationships economically and China and Europe. So the United States will have to see how this goes forward. Henry Kissinger, who turned 97 just the other day, famously said, quote, "A policy that is perceived as having designated China as the enemy, primarily because its economy is growing and because its ideology is distasteful, would end up isolating the United States." So on this fourth point of partners and allies, there's going to have to be very careful about how we develop this. The United States, is only 4.2% of the world population. China's 4 times the size, and obviously any policy trying to deflect China's behavior would have to be done in conjunction with partners who would agree on our approach. So to recap those points, rising power of China, the United States peer competitor doctrine, where we don't want any power dominating Asia. This is something that is just there. Technology, the fact that China is perceived as moving ahead in some technologies that have military implications. Governance, once again, technology plays in, but our 2 countries are on different wavelengths. It's a question of values ultimately, but it's also a question of what technologies will be most adaptive in the new era we're moving into. And then finally, as we've just discussed, allies and partners. Now, the 5th point in closing that I want to raise has to do with the threats. What are the threats facing us today in the current world, really? Many of them are actually global, not just nation to nation. These are global threats, and they are global threats that are shared by all the countries on the planet. These are coming more and more to the fore. Climate change, obviously. Pandemics, well, we're in the middle of that now. It's going to take a lot of international coordination also to stop future epidemics. Nuclear technology, there's an arms race getting underway among the major powers, which could be very destabilizing. And of course, other aspects of tech, from biotech. In a way, we've opened up Pandora's box as a species, and it's going to take a lot of cooperation to keep things stable. In addition to global threats, there are domestic threats that our countries face. Xi Jinping has singled out three that he talks to the population of China about, and those three are debt, inequality, and pollution. These are things that have to be addressed. For the United States, it's pretty clear that we are getting into a debt situation as well. Our tremendous inequality has to be addressed, infrastructure, all kinds of things. In many ways, our two countries, both in the face of these internal threats, could use a stable international environment. So the combination of these shared global threats plus the domestic threats, to my mind, argue for trying to get a handle on these realities that I've been stressing, and through dialogue, consultation, diplomacy, working hard to address these other threats. These other threats cannot be simply neglected. When the U.S. and China cooperate, as they did after 2008 in the economic crisis, or as they did before the Paris Climate Agreement, when a U.S.-China bilateral agreement set the stage for that, things happen and positive steps can be taken. So we're in a period of estrangement now, there's no question about it, and it may get worse. But we've got to be hopeful that there'll be a new cycle, as John Pomfret says, this is how our relations always go, and that we'll move from a cycle of estrangement to one of greater cooperation. I'm not unhopeful that that'll happen, but there's a ways to go before we get there. So I'll stop there. That's pretty much all I had to say, and look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, Tom. That was really an excellent overview of so many issues that are facing our two countries today. Really appreciate that. I'll start with one person's question, which is, what is your view on globalization and what role maybe that has to do with how this is unfolding?
Yeah. By the way, Haiyan, can you see me? I'm stuck on my image here. Can you all see me?
I can see you. Can you see the red button?
No, because this thing it's filling the whole screen right now. So I'm kind of okay. Wait a second.
It should be on top of your screen if you move your mouse.
Yeah, no, it's because I'm on the image right now still. Okay, wait a second. No, okay. Oh, there we go. Got it now. Okay, so push one more button. There we go.
Great.
Yeah. So globalization, yes. I mean, globalization is a huge part of this. With what's happened with the tariff war, the tech war, all these things, now the pandemic, and people wanting to assure localized supply chains, especially in key areas like pharmaceuticals or other things that are deemed important to the national security, there does seem to be a trend now toward some kind of decoupling. How long this will go on, what the future trend will be, it's hard to say. We still have a very globalized world in terms of technology, what's possible, container shipping, the One Belt, One Road initiative is nothing if not further globalization, with high-speed rail going across Eurasia, sea routes opening up across Eurasia. So it's not that globalization is ending totally, but the danger is that we kind of separate out into two sort of globalized ecospheres, in which with China probably dominating one or being the key player in one and aspects of Chinese technology, and then the U.S. pulling away from that, setting up its own sphere. that just seems to me so impractical that I think that there, although there may be some further trend toward that people will pull back from that. I just don't think that's going to happen. You know, the last time, the great era of globalization before World War I, it was a similar era where a rising power, Germany, challenged a status quo power, Britain, and it led to what they call the era of total violence from 1941 to 1945 and the end of globalization, which really didn't really pick up again until China's opening. And so we just have to hope that that cycle doesn't start again. The other aspect of globalization is that it has to be mitigated. It's clear that there have been winners and losers. There's been a tremendous concentration of wealth between countries and within countries under globalization. This is destabilizing. And for globalization to continue and to prosper, there's got to be, in my view, more of a political input and a social input into its effects. Because I don't think it can go on, even without the U.S. China standoff right now. I don't think globalization could go too much further with this degree of inequality and unfairness built into it.
Thank you. If you were a policy advisor to President Trump or whomever takes office in November, what advice would you give the U.S. leader to diffuse this seemingly inevitable conflict?
It would be to get back to basics. There's got to be dialogue. There's got to be structured, ongoing dialogue. It's important to build confidence, and that takes time. You know, there are things called confidence building measures where two countries, we did that with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, building to a greater degree of confidence. That's happened between our economic elites and even between our political elites. Where it has not happened between the US and China is the military elites. There's been very little confidence building over the years. It's been the one area that's been left out of the kind of responsible stakeholder period. So I would focus on that. I think also we just have to be, I was always taught as a diplomat that a key factor in being a good diplomat is empathy. You've got to understand the other side, where the other side is coming from, not because you agree with them, but to understand then how to bring things forward in your own interest. And you know, the last time there was this kind of a hegemonic transition, as they call it, between sort of global hegemons in the 1930s, as Britain began to fade after World War I, its empire was beginning to disintegrate. The United States was not yet ready in the 30s to assume any new kind of mantle, just as China probably is not. I don't think China wants to assume a hegemonic role, and it's not ready for that. But last time that happened, it was between Britain and the United States, and it was one cultural sphere. This time, the transition is going to be civilizational. You know, we are dealing with an ancient, proud civilization in China with its own heritage, its own way of doing things. We've got to understand that better, and we have to train new generations of area specialists who really understand China. Ever since the end of the Cold War, we used to have a lot of area studies on Russia, especially the Soviet Union, but starting in the 90s, when we had won the Cold War, area studies began to collapse in our universities. Everything became functionalized. People studied human rights, which is important, of course, or democratization, or kind of cookie cutters, the idea being that we could then help other countries to become like us. That mindset has got to change. We're dealing with an increasingly multipolar world in which there are rising powers, including China, and so we're going to have to up our game in understanding other countries. But no, the key is going to be dialogue, and finding ways to cooperate on technology, ways to build confidence. You know, some of that was already happening before. It's gotten totally derailed, and I think that can be built again. When you think about it, we're on different sides of the globe. You know, we're not in each other's face particularly. The threats appear to be coming from technologies and from a vision of how European security should be handled, and that's got to be negotiated. It's going to take regional diplomacy in Asia, with both the U.S. and China actively involved. It's going to take a while, but the first steps could be made quite quickly.
Thank you. What do you expect the impact to be on higher education institutions? We're seeing students denied visas. We're seeing students prohibited from, or at least policy proposed to prohibit U.S. students from pursuing PhDs in STEM areas. Do we not think that this not only damages education, but also what's the impact on this long-term for U.S. prosperity?
Yeah, a great question. And it's, well, you know, in the middle of this pandemic now, as we all know, universities and colleges are very strapped economically by the disruptions. Nobody knows what it'll be like in the fall, whether there'll be actual classes, whether students will want to come back for online education. And so the China issue arises now in this larger situation of a potential fiscal crisis in American higher education. As we all know, students, not just from China, but also India, South Korea, and many other countries, have been an important part of the finances of American colleges and universities. They are full-paying students, and they're a big part of the budget. So to dissuade international students from coming is going to have a negative impact on our educational finances. I think in the STEM, I don't know the exact figures at the U, but my impression is that many of the students in the STEM sciences in graduate work are from other countries. They are a pretty large percentage from China, studying engineering. You know, we are, and many of them want to stay and work in the U.S. if they can. So by kind of cutting that off, I think we're doing damage to ourselves. This is one area where I don't think our partners or allies will necessarily follow our lead. Even Australia, which is having problems with China right now, and China pressuring them on certain things, is actively trying to recruit Chinese students into their STEM programs. Europe will do the same. You know, we don't live in a vacuum, and the danger is that we kind of cut off our nose to spite our face in doing this. Also, you know, this kind of knowledge cannot be contained. You cannot contain scientific knowledge. I mean, it's out there. And as I say, if we have problems with China, with the mere fact of students studying here becoming a threat, well, then I think we need to really get a handle on our relationship with China and try to mitigate the situations that have led us to think that way. So anyway, I think it's very disconcerting what's happening. I think it's going to hurt American higher education. You know, there are many people who think that actually American science in our universities benefited greatly from the European immigration in the 1930s and 1940s, that the real sort of mainstays that developed our economic excellence came from there. And you know, I wonder whether on our own, without that kind of input from the outside, we would be capable of maintaining the kind of standards we have right now. So this is something that could be changed, but it's going to take some rethinking of the issue.
So it seems the U.S. was doing more, moving its agenda forward when it was collaborating multilateral fora, and it's had its allies and client states together, whether it was in trade, investment, technology, or political interests. Do you think the next election will alter the U.S.'s approach? And is there hope, or is this a bipartisan situation where we will continue on this road?
Well, first thing I'd say is that in the very partisan context of our upcoming election campaign leading to November, there's going to be a lot of rhetoric. I'm worried that each side will try to use China in a way to discredit the other. So I would not take what you're going to hear the next few months won't necessarily be what a new administration will do. Now, obviously, there's no reason to think that the Trump administration, if it's reelected, no reason to think that they wouldn't continue what they're doing. If you look at Biden and his advisors, I think that they are very much focused on reestablishing good relations and links and cooperation with our allies, both in Europe and in Asia. I think that you'll see them make a major push to try to establish good relations. They know that it'll take a while. There's a lot of distrust right now, especially in Europe, as the polling shows. And I think that they are concerned about China in terms of the first island chain, the idea that I think the Democrats still have the same outlook on the peer competitor issue. I think that they would probably handle it in a less direct way, probably try to do more negotiating, and at least they would be open and consulting about this issue, I think, with the Chinese. They are also worried, as other Republicans, that China, with its One Belt, One Road, 5G and Huawei, maybe setting standards in areas of technology, is de facto establishing a kind of a sphere, an economic sphere of influence. Now, that's all well and good. I mean, Eurasia is right at China's doorstep. We could be doing the same thing with the Americas. Mexico's our #1 trading partner now. We are not focusing on our region the way they are focusing on theirs. And it's hard to say how we could, as I said, the Democrats raised this as an issue, but how they would offset it, I don't know. When China began the One Belt, One Road, it was partly because they have been frozen out of institutions that exist in the world economy already. For example, the World Bank, IMF institutions, it was decided that China should have a bigger role, more seats at the table, also India. Everyone agreed that that should happen, and the U.S. Senate blocked it. So when China rolled out everyone else was agreed. And so when China rolled out the One Belt, One Road, the Obama administration opposed it and asked all of our allies not to get on board with the One Belt, One Road. And it was the British, it was David Cameron, who jumped up and said, we want to be founding members. And with that, all of our allies, except India, and I think Japan, joined the One Belt, One Road. And when Cameron was asked, why did you do that to the Americans? He said, look, we all agreed that China should have a bigger role in the existing administrations. That's been blocked. Institutions has been blocked in the U.S. Senate for 2 years. We can't wait around for American dysfunction. That was, so in trying to, so some people think that the United States should get involved with the One Belt, One Road, actively try to steer it rather than trying to oppose it. So whether the Democrats would go that way, they didn't do it under Obama. The Europeans are involved with the One Belt, One Road. So, and I'm not sure how easy it would be to dissuade them from doing that. So I think you'll have some of the same reflexes with the Democrats, but to a lesser degree and with more openness to dialogue. But they will put a priority on our own allies and getting relations straightened out with them.
You mentioned that this cooperation or decoupling kinds of activities are in trends and cycles. How long do you anticipate the current cycle to last?
Well, frankly, I think that has a lot to do with our domestic politics and to some extent with China's as well. As I say, not to be partisan here, but as I say, I think that the current administration would likely double down on some of what it's doing going forward, with the probable result of estrangement from our allies. And then the question would be how it reacted to that increasingly clear reality. With the Democrats, it would be a slower move toward greater dialogue. I think that the dialogue could be reestablished fairly quickly. That's a matter of will. And once that happens, you can start, I think, slowly moving. What's dangerous right now is that it feels like a slippery slope in which the estrangement, as Pomfret would call it, is going from trade to tech to politics and to military concerns even. That doesn't have to happen in my view. That's a result of diplomacy and certain kind of a back and forth politically between the two countries. It's pretty clear that China now is ready to draw some lines. And I think that they may be prepared, if need be, to try to do a couple of harsh things to show what the results of the current policies are, maybe with a view to the election in the hope that the Democrats will see, oh, these kind of policies provoke that kind of reaction. I mean, we'll see. Huawei it's about to be illegal to use laser, for example, laser equipment made in the U.S. to frame the computer chips that Huawei uses. It'll be very hard to get around that sanction. That could really hurt Huawei. How we react in Hong Kong could provoke a pretty stark reaction from China too. So we'll see. I think there could be another round of titting and tatting here to come, but I think that there's no reason why this should continue long term. It's a matter of getting back to a dialogue with China.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone who's participated today in today's seminar. I think we've come to time. We've gotten a lot of really great questions. Thank you so very much. I also want to offer a special thank you to all of you who have supported us through generous gifts to the China Center's Directors Fund. This program would not be possible without your financial support from our community. And your generous support, the China Center will continue to provide programs that address the challenges and opportunities of the U.S. China relationship. So thank you all for participating, and thanks for your generosity. I hope you have an excellent afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. Thanks, everybody.